Okay, I will try. Okay.
Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the side event of the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. My name is Jerome Ilagan, and I'm a co-chair of the Executive Committee. In this side event, we aim to showcase various types of losses and damages, especially those related to slow onset events and processes, associated policy instruments, and support available to manage them. This panel is composed of two discussions, the first on impacts and risks from a science and policy perspective, and the second on action and policy support, including the work of the WIM ExCom and its expert groups. Discussions will include losses and damages related to human mobility and livelihoods, including non-economic losses such as cultural heritage. The event also builds on deliberations of the International Migration Review Forum, as well as the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the expert groups, notably the Task Force on Displacement, especially the International Organization for Migration, and the Platform on Disaster Displacement, as well as a technical expert group on comprehensive risk management for supporting the organization of this event, together with the UNFCCC Secretariat. Now I'm very pleased to introduce our distinguished speakers for today's discussion. For panel one, Ms. Adelle Thomas, drafting author, Summary for Policymakers, IPCC. Mr. Filimone Tuivanualevu, Senior Climate Change Adaptation Officer, Government of Fiji. Mr. Sani Ayouba, Executive Director of JVE, Niger. And then Ms. Sabantho Corrie-Edghill of the Caribbean Amerindian Development Organization. For panel two, we have my fellow WIM ExCom colleague, Mr. Nedal Katbeh-Bader. Mr. Maarten van Alast, Director of the Red Crescent Climate Center. Ms. Loretta Hieber Girardet, Chief Risk Knowledge Monitoring and Capacity Development Branch of UNDRR. And Ms. Caroline Dumas, IOM Director General, Special Envoy on Migration and Climate Action, and former French Ambassador. The first panel, the State of Play Impacts and Risks. The existing losses and damages associated with slow onset impacts of climate change. We will now start with the first panel discussion on the existing losses and damages associated with slow onset impacts of climate change. I would like to ask Ms. Adelle Thomas, as one of the authors of the sixth assessment report of the IPCC, what does the IPCC tell us about existing and projected losses and damages, especially related to slow onset events and processes, and how they will affect people, livelihoods, ecosystems, and infrastructures in different climate scenarios? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this event on behalf of the IPCC. I'd just like to briefly clarify the definitions that we use in the Working Group 2 report, and we differentiate between loss and damage with capital letters and losses and damages with lowercase letters. We use the capital letter loss and damage to refer to what's happening in the UNFCCC process, including what's happening with the WIM and its expert groups. And we use the lowercase term losses and damages to broadly refer to harm from observed impacts and projected risks. And these losses and damages can be economic or non-economic, and we assess losses and damages across all regions. And so coming from the report, the Working Group 2 report, we have a few key messages on losses and damages, and I will share 3 of them with you this afternoon. The first key message is that losses and damages are already happening. We find that current levels of global warming at 1.1 degrees has already caused dangerous and widespread losses and damages to nature and to billions of people around the world, despite adaptation efforts. And this is due to both extreme events and slow onset events, as well as the interactions between the two of them. We find a concentration of people in developing countries considered highly vulnerable to climate change, with people in informal settlements being the most vulnerable. This figure further illustrates some of the harm already being experienced in ecosystems. We find with high confidence that climate change has caused substantial damages and increasingly irreversible losses across a range of ecosystems. And we have an assessment at the global scale and also for the major regions showing these impacts for terrestrial, freshwater, and ocean ecosystems. In human systems, we also find that climate change has had negative impacts across the globe for water scarcity, food production, health, well-being, and for cities, settlements, and infrastructure. Some of these impacts can be attributed to slow onset processes, such as ocean acidification, sea level rise, and changes in precipitation. And this assessment is provided again for regions and for particularly vulnerable areas, including cities by the sea. We have also conducted an assessment of non-economic losses and damages and shown where there is scientific documentation of these occurring. And so this map is not exhaustive. It's meant to show examples of different types of non-economic losses and damages associated with climate hazards that have been attributed to climate change. And so we can see that these are being experienced across the globe. We provide examples and summaries of these non-economic losses to help illustrate this point. And we have evidence from extreme events such as forest fires, as well as from slow onset events such as sea level rise. What's important to note is that slow onset events such as sea level rise can actually increase the harm from extreme events, particularly events such as tropical cyclones or coastal flooding. So we don't look at these as two separate processes. There's an interaction between slow onset events and extreme events that is already resulting in both economic and non-economic losses and damages. The second key message is that future losses and damages are projected to increase as global temperatures rise. Multiple climate hazards will continue to present risks to both ecosystems and humans, and we find that risks for future losses and damages are highest for nature and people in regions that are experiencing the highest temperatures, those living along coastlines, and in the frozen parts of the world. And sea level rise in particular is a slow onset event that will put people that are living in coastal cities and settlements at greater flood risk. It will result in low-lying coastal ecosystems such as mangroves being submerged and lost. And the long-term impacts of sea level rise may also lead to reduced habitability of islands, resulting in increased displacement. We have updated the reasons for concern diagram, which communicates scientific understanding about the accrual of risk. And what's important to get from this updated assessment is that we have assessed with greater confidence that high and very high risks are projected to occur at lower levels of global warming. So risks are escalating sooner than was assessed in previous IPCC reports. And the third and final key message for this afternoon is that losses and damages remain and are unequally distributed. We find that even effective adaptation does not prevent all losses and damages. These harmful effects of climate change are unequally distributed across systems, regions, and sectors, and they are concentrated among the most poorest and vulnerable groups. We also find that current financial, governance, and institutional arrangements are not comprehensively addressing existing losses and damages. And just to close, there's a summary of where to find key findings on losses and damages and the summary for policymakers for the Working Group 2. I will not go into detail, but this presentation will be available on the website afterwards so that you can have it as a resource. And thank you.
Thanks so much, Adele. And I'd like to reiterate that during the 15th meeting of the ExCom, we took note of the importance of basing our work and the work of the expert groups on the best available science. Let us now move on to the next. From the science perspective, we move on to policy side. Mr. Filimone Tuivanualevu from Fiji will share with us the answer to the question, what have been your experiences in Fiji in addressing sea level rise, including challenges related to human mobility? The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. Good evening to you all. Sorry I don't have a presentation, but I will try my best to articulate the policy implementations that we have back at home in Fiji. So the forced movement of people raises multiple protection concerns, undermines development gains, affects human rights and human security across the globe. It can have devastating social, economic, health and physiological impacts on individuals and communities and affect the effective enjoyment of their human rights. The IPCC AR6 assessment report acknowledges that soft limits to some human adaptations have been reached and hard limits to adaptations have been reached in some ecosystems, as previously mentioned by the previous panelists. This tells us that even effective adaptation cannot avert or minimize all losses and damage. The science speaks for itself, as my co-panelist has thoroughly elaborated on. Much of what has been shared here in the panel discussion is reflected on the ground in my home in the Fiji Islands. Climate change poses a threat to the existence of my people, many of whom reside in coastal villages and settlements, pride themselves with their connection to the ocean and their resiliency for generations. The infringing waves now threatens their homes, their security, and their identity. The government of Fiji has relocated a total of 6 highly vulnerable coastal communities inland to higher ground, with over 40 communities that are currently on the wait list. And we are now in the process of relocating 2 communities that have been displaced due to a recent tropical cyclone that impacted our islands. As we all know, poorly prepared and managed planned relocation can exacerbate pre-existing conditions of vulnerability, severely impactful. Disproportionate impacts are also borne more strongly by least developing countries and small developing states. In this regard, the planned relocation guidelines and displacement guidelines was released by my government to assist the relevant stakeholders on the ground to better coordinate their efforts through a more streamlined and guided approach. This is further solidified with the inclusion of the relocation process in the Climate Change Act, which was just recently enacted by our Parliament, to give the responsible entities mandate in carrying out their duties and responsibilities. The enormity and the sensitivity of the relocation process is indeed the mammoth task, and the need for well-coordinated effort to enable the smooth transition of displaced communities to their new homes is of paramount importance. The Fijian government has long recognized the threat of climate change and disasters posed to our territory, and it has taken significant work to develop responsive laws and policies at the national level. Additionally, the National Relocation Trust Fund was established to meet some of the funding needs and arrangement that existed towards addressing national climate mobility issues. The first of its kind, the trust fund had benefited from government taxes on prescribed services and incomes. However, the fund does not adequately satisfy the enormity of costs incurred due to its dependence on the global economy and the vast slow onset events and the rapid onset events that affect us year in and year out. Unlike the larger economies that have the luxury of meeting the impacts of losses and damages within days. For us and many seeds alike, it takes months and years to fully rehabilitate from these losses and damages. Lastly, the forced movement of people raises multiple protection concerns, undermines development gains, affects human rights and security across the globe. It can have devastating social, economic, health, and physiological impacts on the communities. We are hopeful for successful SB session in the upcoming days from positive outcomes going into COP27 through a cooperation and compromise in addressing the urgent needs for losses and damages. Tuivanualevu, and thank you.
That Fijian greeting is always a rhythm of life. Thank you. Now that we have a question already addressed by our representative from the government of Fiji, we will now have Mr. Sani Ayouba, Executive Director of the JVE, Niger. To answer the question, I'd like to know, as a leader of a youth volunteering group for the environment in Niger, what have been your experiences on loss and damage associated with the certification and land degradation? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Good evening, everyone. So it's a pleasure for me to be here also to share some aspect of loss and damage associated with desertification and land degradation in Niger. Niger is part of West Africa and part of Sahel region also. Next slide, please. When it's come to highlight the climate threat in the sector in Niger, we will see that the climate change impacted the main sector as agriculture, livestock, forestry, and the water resource also. And in Niger, we have like the half part of the country that is facing to the desertification issue. And every year we lost more than 300,000 hectares of land due to degradation. And this have also significant effect on food and nutritional security throughout the decline in agro-silvopastoral and fishery production, because the main activities in Niger are based on agriculture and animal husbandry. And the climate impacts also have a kind of movement, try to lead the movement for migration displacement of the community at the country level. So when it's come to talk for the next slide, please, for loss and damage, we try to see how this impacted like the 3 points, the food system, the health and social cultural impact, and human mobility also. We have several issues on the food system because the loss and damage include temporary or permanent food insecurity. In the past, it's like every 10 years that we are facing this issue. Now it's every year that the country and the communities are facing to this food insecurity. We have the loss of agricultural land and the land fertility. We have this overexploitation of the natural resources, even we don't have enough, but it's overexploited. We have this resurgence of climate-sensitive disease. Every year we have this malaria that have a serious impact on children and women health. We have also in terms of health and social-cultural impact, the loss of culture and ways of life. And now we have this women displacement, the migration, and of course we have several conflicts related to access of natural resources, because we have these pastoral communities and the farmer communities that every year they are facing with some challenging due to the climate change impact and loss and damage. The next slide, please. So our organization as a Young Volunteer for Environment tried to build resilience and addressing risk throughout these 4 key points. The first one is the resilience through our multi-stakeholder engagement. We try to involve young people, the vulnerable communities, and some CSOs to try to deal with the issue and have like a common synergy together. And it's very important also, the second point, the climate and disaster risk transfer. It's very important to see how the risk can inform the development and how we can have this finance option, like the climate insurance at country or community level. It's very important for us to see how we can develop this kind of innovative solution. And also, third point is like the risk management, that we try to have some evidence and research to scaling up some good practice, because the community have experiences to deal with that. So how we can improve or how we can scale up the good practice that we have coming from the ground. And we think it's very important also to have this integrated approach and the synergy between the processes. A month ago, last month, we were in Côte d'Ivoire for the UNCCD conferences. It's very important to see the kind of linkage between UNDRR, UNCCD, UNFCCC, and the SDG, all this process, and how we can have also the integrated approach between stakeholders. It's very important for us to see as young and women-led organization how to have this. The next slide. And according to the recent study made by IOM in Niger, we taken part of this study. It's very important to see in terms of household, like 51% of the household relate that a family member was forced to migrate due to climate change or environmental degradation. So at the country level, every year we are facing to this kind of displacement of the community. Some people that leave their village to go to urban area or to cross the country and go to desert or other side of the country because of the loss and also the degradation of their agricultural land. And other point is like 45% of internal migrants that we have would like to return of their places of origin if they had the opportunity to develop climate resilient socioeconomic activities there. But people don't have the choice, so they move. But they reaffirm that if they have a kind of opportunity to build more resilience, they can go back to their main home. Next slide, please. We have like a kind of activities with Sleek Contrast and the Africa Youth Initiative on Climate Change is like a kind of youth movement, the chapter in Niger. We try to conduct the climate and this women mobility activities that try to engage several stakeholders, and also we have some case studies and try to identify some key points for integration of climate and this migration into climate policy, like we are actually in the process of developing our adaptation action plan. So we try to see which kind of entry point can we have to put the climate and this migration inside. And also we try to develop a kind of perspective on livelihood and entrepreneurship support for migrant communities through our Ethical X Hub. So that can help young people and the migrants also to have this kind of opportunities to try to build resilience at the community level and maybe to be more resilient when it comes to be faced to hazard or some risk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sani. Thanks very much to that particular discussion on loss and damage associated with the certification. Now we will have Ms. Sabantho, Corrie-Edghill of the Caribbean Amerindian Development Organization. And your question is, could you share some examples of how the wealth of traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples and local communities could be better used to address cultural heritage losses associated with climate change? The floor is yours.
Is it? Oh, okay, there it is. Thank you so much for the question. Before I reflect on it from the lens of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Sabantho, which in the Lokono Arawak language means beautiful little ground dove. I am a 23-year-old Indigenous woman living in an urban society outside of my ancestral community. a 240 square mile, 1,700 person ancestral Pakuri Lokono Arawak territory in Region 4, Guyana, Northeast South America. I live in Barbados, another island nation altogether in the Eastern Lesser Antilles in the Caribbean. First, allow me to say that indigenous peoples from all the 7 socio-cultural regions are already losing plenty. From the glaciers melting to the fast advancement of the desert, from the forest fires to the sea level rising, our communities are displaced and some of them forever from our ancestral lands. We are experiencing firsthand extreme weather events that are causing damages to our peoples, and we are losing our cultures, identities, and even our traditional knowledge. So to answer your question on how the wealth of traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples contributes to addressing cultural heritage losses associated with climate change, in my own indigenous community in Guyana, considered an extension of the Caribbean region, our Mahaika River used to flood once in a decade during the rainy season. But since 2019, flooding has occurred every single year, and now the dry seasons are drier and hotter. Farmers used to be able to work with exposed backs from 7 a.m. to midday, then take a 2-hour rest and put in another 3 hours till 5 p.m., then walk home. Now the sun and heat are so unbearable that they have to cover their skin and work shorter days due to the intense weather conditions. 25% of formerly productive hours are lost each day, with only 6 hours of labor possible, because no one lives on the tribal farmlands as they are many miles from the village. The deforestation of certain water catchment areas for farming have affected the quality of water in several rivers that are fed by multiple mountain streams. The traditional farming practices of land preparation for the cultivation of food is more unpredictable due to the changes of weather patterns. Usually farmers would cut down the land in the dry season around February or March and then plant in time for the upcoming wet season in May and June. But nowadays, the weather pattern is very different and now completely unpredictable. I would also like to highlight an example from the Amazon where subsistence agricultural practices have been affected by extensive rainy seasons and extensive dry seasons, as well as with the Sahel people of Africa who are already dying. To face these extreme events that affect our continuity of the regular planting and harvesting practices we use, our indigenous people's traditional knowledge to prevent and face the consequences. In this case, the role of women is crucial, as in our communities, women are often the custodians of indigenous knowledge, which has been passed down through generations. We provide an essential link between the natural environment and human society, and are responsible for, amongst other things, managing food security or maintaining crop diversity. But we are often more vulnerable than men to the impact of climate change, particularly in developing countries where we have limited access to resources, economic opportunities, and decision-making positions. This is particularly true for women living in rural areas who rely on natural resources for their livelihoods, or who face discrimination in accessing public services such as water, education, and healthcare. The spiritual connection of the collective connection between the inhabitants have allowed rebuilding their areas and expanding their knowledge to new generations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's the first panel. And before we move on to the next panel, may we invite our speakers to share any view that has been covered by the first theme before we move on to the next. If there are any other insights that you would like to share across the topics of the first panel. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, thank you to the co-panelists. And I think these, really good examples of the lived experience of losses and damages, which helped to flesh out our scientific assessment that was done in Working Group 2. So from Fiji, the links to human rights with sea level rise and displacement, from Niger talking about food insecurity, and in the Caribbean really highlighting those gender disparities, I think helps to flesh out some of the more technical assessment that we've done in the Working Group 2. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much from our distinguished speaker from the IPCC. So can we move to the next?
Shall we change panels?
Would you like? Okay.
Shall we change panels now?
Yes. Thank you. We will welcome the second panel. Thank you, distinguished speakers. We now invite the speakers for the second panel. Second panel, action and policy support. The role of climate change policies, action and support in averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. In particular, in the second panel, we want to look at how the ExCom expert groups can better respond to and address the different challenges of losses and damages related to slow onset events. And we have the honor of a colleague at the ExCom, Mr. Nedal Bader, to introduce the second panel. Nedal, please.
Thank you, Jerome, and good afternoon. Indeed, it is my pleasure to share brief overview remarks at the outset of this second panel on action and policy support. I'd like to briefly present some of the past and ongoing work of the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, in short, WIM ExCom, that aim to contribute to filling the gap on action and policy support to address loss and damage. The WIM ExCom has been providing policy-relevant information and recommendations on averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, and recommendations as well in that regard. For climate, where we have loss and damage as a result of the climate change impacts, notably through its 5 expert working groups that works online with the and respond to the work program of the ExCom. Namely, we have the task force on displacement, expert group on non-economic losses, the expert group on slow onset events, expert group on action and support, and the technical expert group on comprehensive risk management. Such guidance include, inter alia, the compendium on comprehensive risk management, recommendations on human mobility and climate change in national policies and frameworks, among others. This year, the first cross-expert group meeting will take place at the margins of ExCom 16, between 6 to 8 July. The deliberations will help advance the selection of themes for technical guides, aiming to help navigate stakeholders at different levels and scale toward relevant materials in the domain of the work stream of the Warsaw International Mechanism. The technical guides will cover risk assessment and how the resulting loss and damage can be approached. We invite countries to make use of the products developed by the WIM ExCom and expert groups. We will now hear perspectives from ExCom groups on action and support, on action and policy support, notably the task force on displacement and the technical expert group on the comprehensive risk management. They will share with us and shed light on some of the available products and guidance developed under the WIM ExCom, notably around the risk assessment and human mobility. And I'd like to ask kindly the panelists, while doing so, to react to the challenges that were presented and discussed during the first panel. Thank you. Back to you, Jerome.
Thanks so much, colleague Nedal. Now we will have Mr. Maarten Aalst, Director of the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. Let me ask the question, sir. I don't see the question. Perhaps what's the relevance of the Red Crescent towards this end? It's a global platform in addressing the policy and action and support. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and great to have this discussion today at the start of these 2 weeks of negotiations. And I think our first panel gave a very clear science overview that this is a discussion we need to have today, but also all those examples from practice that show that it's urgent on the one hand to address what we're already facing today, but also what we know is going to come our way in the near future. I am Maarten van Aalst. I'm director, as you mentioned, of a reference center in the IFRC, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, which indeed 20 years ago many people were asking, why are you engaged in climate change discussions? And I think today that question is no longer being asked, at least not in our network. Climate change has become one of the top 5 priorities for the IFRC in the coming decade, because we're seeing these impacts in our humanitarian work on the front lines of the rising risks every day. And we recognize that response, or even all the work we do on disaster risk reduction in these communities on our own, is not going to be the answer. This requires systemic solutions, many types of actors working together, and very much also a concerted effort on the big global climate agendas. First of all, of course, reducing emissions, as Adelle also very clearly pointed out, and a colleague of hers in the IPCC chapter that put all this evidence together. It's very clear if we don't reduce emissions, things will get out of hand. We're already reaching limits to adaptation today, and it will result in more loss and damage. Secondly, we need to invest more in adaptation. But then thirdly, we do need to deal with the impacts that are coming our way today. And I wanted to share a few reflections on how we're doing on that so far. I'm a member of the technical expert group on comprehensive risk management. So it's particularly been looking at a number of existing efforts to manage risk and how those do and don't work together. I'm aware that there's many other areas of work where I think the progress so far has been slower. So I think there's also an important discussion to be had, taking stock, for instance, the extent to which we're already addressing the longer term impacts as well. But in the short term, we have seen real progress. So the whole agenda around anticipatory action, turning early warnings into early actions, is something that existed for a long time, for instance, in humanitarian work. And we have saved millions of lives over the years, providing better early warnings to people. But we know we still have gaps in many places. And importantly, we're sometimes saving lives, but not livelihoods. So we have struggled with this for many years. And in the past 5 to 10 years, there's been a transformation where humanitarian financing is more anticipatory now. We can allocate humanitarian financing before a disaster happens. However, that is still piecemeal compared to the scale of the problem. And it's not integrated in the sense that sometimes our risk assessments for these early warning systems are not necessarily informing the adaptation risk assessments that are used for longer term planning. So putting those pieces together is really critical. A second real challenge is that while the large-scale financing mechanisms are opening up, they're also really stretched. And on our side of that spectrum, the humanitarian side, we see donors, the humanitarian donors, willing to become more flexible, but it's still very disconnected from the climate funding channels that exist. And we do hear humanitarian donors asking the question, should we support preparedness in these local communities and early warning systems, or should you actually go to our climate colleagues? But then we go to the climate colleagues, and the question is, isn't our first job mitigation, reducing emissions, but then secondly, adaptation for the longer term, and shouldn't stuff deal with disasters, not go to our humanitarian colleagues? So you still see these silos in the financing channels. And I think one of the questions for our architecture for loss and damage finance is how we sort that out. Partly as a byproduct of that, many of the solutions don't reach the most vulnerable contexts. Either countries that are actually most vulnerable but don't access the financing, or also even within those countries, or also in slightly less vulnerable countries on an aggregate level, the most vulnerable communities in those countries. So how we reach the last mile in terms of these financing systems, preventing but also dealing with losses and damages we already see is the big question that I don't think we've cracked. And I'm very pleased, and I guess Loretta might say more of this also around the conclusions of Bali and the important discussions in UNDRR, but also the United Nations Secretary General's call to have early warning systems for everyone. It's of course not about just supplying early warnings for everyone, it's enabling everyone, also in the most vulnerable context, for instance all those conflict-affected places in East Africa where people are currently going hungry due to drought, but aggravated by the local conflict, aggravated by the global food insecurity crisis, aggravated by the heat in South Asia and the export ban in India. All those things adding up is really the picture we're seeing. And I think we need to ask ourselves a really honest question. if we're having these discussions on loss and damage these 2 weeks in Bonn? Are the solutions we're trying to put together here up to the task? Are we having a negotiation dance about a little bit more financing to make a symbolic step forward? Or are we actually coming up with solutions that connect these worlds and strengthen the global response to this at a scale that is needed in light of the global crisis we're facing today? So I'll leave with that challenge. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave this discussion, unfortunately, before time, because I'm due to speak in the IPCC discussion in the main plenary. But there are IFRC colleagues of mine behind the room in case there are further operational questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Maarten. But before you leave, I've said the question, but apparently we will have some more engagements to come, and we will focus on the nexuses, not just of the Red Cross, but the entire team that is inside this room today. Thank you so much. Our next distinguished speaker is Ms. Lori from UNDRR, and this is the question. What are your insights as a member of the technical expert group on comprehensive risk management? What do the risk profile assessments tell us? And how can some of these insights be applied to the challenges presented by our speakers before? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And maybe just to pick up on a point that Maarten just made. Indeed, we have just concluded a 7,000-person strong event in Bali, Indonesia. It's the global platform, which is mandated by the General Assembly every 3 years to look at disaster risk reduction. And I think really it was quite remarkable to see that in the course of the last just 3 years, the difference we have seen in terms of the agenda and the speaker's attention to climate change. So in other words, it's becoming really very much the most prevalent issue in the disaster risk reduction community. And what I think is quite relevant for today's discussion is that what we're hearing from countries is that they're really challenged to understand the risks associated both with extreme events, but also the slow onset events, and how these two interact to enhance and to actually challenge countries to be able to manage climate-related risks. And we heard from Adelle just in the previous panel about the interactions and really being able to understand these interactions. How is sea level rise impacting tsunami risk, for example? We saw that in Tonga. And we also heard from Sani about Niger and displacement and migration induced by climate change. And of course, this has a tremendous impact on vulnerability and on exposure, as well as food insecurity as well. The role of gender was raised, and we know that regardless of the disaster, it is often women and children that have most likely to have the worst impacts. We need a multidimensional approach to managing this, and we need to be able to make better sense of the risks that we are facing, both from slow onset and from what we call in the disaster risk reduction community sudden onset events or extreme events. So what I'd like to do is just share with you now a bit, we have a few slides, that will talk to what is currently being done in the technical expert group of comprehensive risk management. What are some of the tools that we have at our disposal, all the while recognizing that they are still insufficient and that we need to come together to be better able to assess these risks. So this particular tool right here has just been released. It's the Technical Guidance on Comprehensive Risk Assessment and Planning in the Context of Climate Change. And this is a joint UNDRR GIZ publication that really is aiming to put together some principles and some guidelines for comprehensive risk management. Now, I just mentioned the global platform, and one of the outcomes of the global platform was this call for comprehensive risk management. We know that we are operating in silos. And those that are working with extreme events are sitting in this ministry, while those that are working on slow onset processes are sitting on that ministry, and sometimes these two worlds are not converging. And yet they need to, because we cannot have separate planning processes. They really do need to come together. This guidance enables us to do so. Next slide, please. I'd like to just point out some of the principles behind this, because these principles for comprehensive risk assessment are valid both for extreme events, but also for slow onset processes. And that is that our starting point, climate change is the underlying risk driver. Now, we know that it's modifying climate-related hazards. You know, storms are becoming more unpredictable, more intense, but it's also driving up vulnerability and exposure, and we heard a bit about this in the previous panel. And the impacts that we're seeing are cascading. They're compounding vulnerability. So what we really need are inclusive, multi-sectoral, multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder approaches. And we need to prioritize things such as nature-based solutions. But also, we have to really look at our values when we want to determine what is our risk tolerance, how much are we going to accept, and how much are we going to transfer versus how much are we going to try to mitigate. And this really requires a very comprehensive approach, but a dialogue that starts at the local level and is very inclusive of all different types of society. The next slide can look a little bit daunting, but it is actually quite simple. It's the comprehensive risk assessment framework, which essentially says you need to look at climate or hazards, climate and non-climate together. And those of you who are familiar with the Sendai framework will know that we talk about a range of risks to society, natural hazards as well as environmental, biological, etc., technological. I mean, the COVID pandemic is a good example of this. But really trying to understand how climate is also driving up vulnerability and exposure. And this need for a comprehensive risk assessment as the foundation to really lead to risk-informed decision-making and planning, whether it's for a DRR strategy, whether it's for a NAP, whether it's for a development plan, you still need to have that understanding of risk. Next slide, please. But we're not starting at scratch, and sometimes it occurs to me that perhaps we're not as aware as we might be that countries are collecting information on loss and damage. And currently, we have over 110 countries that have loss and damage databases. And what are these? Well, they're essentially a way of tracking the impacts, the consequences, the symptoms of extreme events and slow onset events as well, direct and indirect. These loss and damage databases really do need to be put to use. Sometimes they sit perhaps a bit siloed in one ministry, but I think there's really an opportunity for those of us working in this domain in climate action to see how can we better understand the historical losses to do better planning for the future. I just want to mention, next slide please, that this information become official statistics for reporting on the Sendai framework. And this is extremely relevant for the loss and damage discussion. How many people are dying because of disaster events? How many people are affected? What are the economic losses that we are incurring? We are aggregating this information, and it's available to be used to help inform the decisions that need to be made. My final slide is that there's a new tool that we've been developing called the RIX, which is the Risk Information Exchange. And this is a database which is now being rolled out in a few different countries. Our aim is to go to 54 countries. And it's essentially pulling together historical data through the loss and damage databases with future climate projections and other type of vulnerability and exposure information. What we see in many countries is that they say we don't have enough data to have informed decisions. Often that data is just sitting in very different pockets of government or NGOs or the UN system, and they're not easily brought together to tell the story of what are the climate change impacts, what are the disaster risks that are being faced. So this RIX, as we call it, really is designed to enhance risk understanding at a country level and to better aggregate. It's a data aggregator. And finally, my last slide is as I mentioned before, managing extreme events and slow onset events, managing DRR and climate action cannot be seen as separate processes. We really do need to bring it together. And there is a program underway called Comprehensive Risk Management. The term is familiar to you all, where we're really trying to support the SIDS in particular and the LDCs to look at how do you better integrate climate and non-climate risk reduction efforts, how do you build off of a common risk assessment, and ultimately how do you use this information for more climate-sensitive DRR strategies and more risk-informed national adaptation planning. we have a long way to go. We don't have the methodologies in place really yet to assess low onset events like we do for extreme events, and those silos still exist. But I certainly hope that those of you working in climate change reach out to your partners working on DRR in your countries and see how we can forge that, that synergy that's needed to take this work forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Last but not the least, my question goes to Madam Ambassador Caroline Dumas, IOM Director General's Special Envoy on Migration and Climate Action, and member of the Task Force on Displacement. Could you lay out some reflections on policies, action, and support regarding losses and damages related to slow onset events and challenges to human mobility, including migration, displacement, and planned relocation? From the work with the Task Force on Displacement, and maybe it's good to react to some of what we have heard in the first panel, for example, related to sea level rise or land degradation. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon to all. I just would like maybe to try to draw a few conclusions of what we heard and the very interesting different interventions. Maybe, I mean, three points. I mean, we heard about the risks due to climate change, about the impacts, and about maybe the solutions. The risks, we heard from IPCC that science is clear, losses and damages are already everywhere, occurring everywhere on the planet, despite efforts for adaptation. And they lead to economic and non-economic consequences, very dire consequences, especially, we heard it and we know it, especially on vulnerable countries, or most vulnerable, I would say, people and countries. We learned that, and we heard, rather, even if we didn't learn it, that losses and damages will increase, and with increased global warming, of course, and will lead to increased displacement. And we heard as well that these losses and damages remain unequally distributed. We heard from examples from the ground, if I can say, from Fiji and from Niger, that these elements from the science, I mean, are already impacting again on economic and non-economic level. They are a threat to people. We heard from the representative of Fiji. Many communities have already, thousands of people have already been relocated in Fiji. We heard as well from Niger that we have as well key sectors of economy which are being impacted. I mean, the food, the whole food system, if I can say, health as well, the health system. You even mentioned malaria, recent malaria, which was linked to climate change. And, of course, human mobility again with another dimension, which is an important word that we have to retain as well, which is consequences in terms of security as well among people and the question of the access to resources. In these descriptions, if I can say, we heard an important word, which is resilience. The need to build more resilience, not only of risk management, but to build more resilience. And now coming to the solutions, if I can say, I would say maybe that we heard that the humanitarian approach that we are used to when we are in situations of fast onset events is no more enough, if I can say. We have to have a much global approach which registers maybe in the humanitarian development and peace nexus. We are exactly in the HDPN nexus when we talk about preventive action, adaptation, but as well disaster risk reduction, kind of preparedness, the disaster risk reduction, which was as well quoted by our interlocutor from UNDRR, but all the development which is needed in terms of access to services for the people, either in advance, I mean, to try to build the resilience, or after the events, I mean, services of education, of health, of proper relocation, and of starting new lives, of jobs, of starting maybe of building on new skills and starting new life. Beyond the HDPN nexus, I would maybe insist on the fact, and we heard it, I mean, from IFRC, from UNDRR, and from the countries on which we had, I mean, from which we had examples, I mean, Niger and Fiji. It's evident that the solutions are at three levels: the local level, the national level, but as well the international level. So the local level, we need good policies, we need good adaptation policies, but as well good development policies. If I can say, we need integrated approach at the national level, much more of multidimensional approaches, as it was said by UNDRR, integrated approaches between all stakeholders of the different sectors even we just mentioned, and of course an integrated, and it was as well said by our speaker from Niger, in more of integrated approach between migration and climate change. So it means that we have to go more towards an integration of the human mobility dimension in climate change policies, but as well probably, I mean, when we talk to leaders of migration, in charge of migration, home affairs ministers or administrations, they do have to take into account climate change dimensions. So it's a multidimensional approach that we heard. We as well heard that in these policies, we heard from IFRC that about the importance of finance, good, if I can say, adequate financing, but as well I would add sustainable financing to support adaptation policies, but as well the development policies which go with these with these disaster risk, I mean, and all the risk reduction, if I can say. This is mostly, I mean, the work of the TFD as well, the Task Force for Displacement. This is the work that the WIM, the Warsaw International Mechanism, is trying to achieve within the different working groups that were recalled by Jerome. And as it was said by one of our interlocutors, a lot still remains to be done. And we heard that there are a lot of expectations towards COP27 now to address both dimensions. I mean, the pure climate change impacts plus the mobility dimension. So a lot remains to be done at the local level, at the national level, but as well at the international level. It's all our responsibility, of course. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Madam Ambassador, and all the speakers. We will now open the floor for questions and comments from participants in the room. Questions from the floor? Lian, my colleague in the ExCom, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone.
Mike.
I want to say
Yeah, I think we're being streamed, so you should get a mic.
hello? Better? Okay, great. Good afternoon again, everyone. I want to say thanks to both the panel that just spoke as well as the one before. I think the information is so rich and I think should be informing our national and local actions, policies, etc. I wondered if we could hear a little bit more about RICS. It seems very interesting. We've heard a lot as well about existing databases. And I think in your presentation, Loretta, I hope I got your name correctly. Yes, you spoke about the fact that there are so many databases that are not necessarily being used to the full extent that it could and should be used. So this RIC sounds very interesting, and I think, as you said, it has the potential to really influence how we work at the national level. So any further reflections on when it will be rolled out, how would be very welcomed. Thanks.
Sure.
You have the floor.
Thank you very much for the question. RICS, it used to be called the National Risk Information Portal, but we had to change it because the idea that it's nationally owned suggested a political process that not all countries were ready for. But a RICS is essentially, it's a service to the broader community that UNDRR is doing with multiple partners. We see in many countries that data being collected by the humanitarians is not necessarily used by development actors. Data projections, climate projections that are being produced by the World Meteorological Organization are not being used by, for example, development planning ministries, for example, or they don't know how to use it, or it's not, it's too complicated, it hasn't been actually, I would say, downscaled to local level. I mean, there's all sorts of problems, but the reality is that I think I can say there's more data available than we often think. We often say, oh, there's just no data. Well, the data is there, but it's not sitting there. I can give you an example from my own experience. Before I became chief of the risk knowledge branch, I was the regional director for Asia Pacific for UNDRR. And I was asked to work with colleagues in Mongolia to look at the question of the ZOOD, an anticipatory action, which Maarten was just talking about. And in order to take an anticipatory action or put in place such a program, you need to have certain triggers. And the data, you need to know about precipitation, you need to know about coping mechanisms, you need to know about the location of populations, displacement figures, et cetera, et cetera. It's all sitting completely scattered. And it takes a lot of time for agencies to actually look for that information. So we have gone through a process of consultation with many partners to see what is the type of information that you actually need to make a risk-informed decision. What's the vulnerability? What's the exposure? What's the displacement figures? What are the climate projections? What are the hazards? What are the most frequent hazards that the country has been facing for the last couple of years? And we've pulled them together essentially in this RICS database. But what we're doing is essentially compiling it country by country so that the information is readily available. But that work doesn't stop there. The countries that we've started to roll this out include Bangladesh, Pakistan, South Sudan, Eswatini, Costa Rica. Based on that information, we're then supporting the countries to answer some specific questions that they have. So, for example, what is the greatest risk my country faces in the next 5 years that I need to be able to mitigate? And we undertake a bespoke analytical analysis or product for them, which are essentially bringing in risk experts to help them analyze these specific risks. But then we also have a third pillar of this work, which is capacity development. And what it is how do you use this information, so member states, but also the UN system, to make more risk-informed planning decisions. And so this is a whole capacity development angle as well. And we recently had a workshop in Somalia in which there were over 20 line ministries participating. So it's really a question of helping countries understand their past disasters, but what the future is also bringing. And we're doing this in collaboration with the World Meteorological Organization, for example, so that they can make better informed decisions moving forward, what we call risk-informed development, but also risk-informed humanitarian planning as well. So we're also working in high complex emergency settings like South Sudan. So that's what the RICS is, and if funding is available, we'll be able to expand it to more countries. But right now, we are working in about 20 countries, or getting it off the ground in 20 countries. Yeah.
Thank you so much for those insightful response. And of course, that question from Lian is also compelling because, we need that scientific basis to have that fit-for-purpose intervention. Some more questions from the floor. Ambassador Adelle, is that you? Yes. Ambassador Adelle, please.
Thank you very much, Excellencies, friends and colleagues. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the excellent presentations. I think it's very informative. And I would like to introduce myself. My name is Adam Barbosa from Timor-Leste. I am coordinator for loss and damage on behalf of the LDCs. My question is very much focusing on how global community can take action to provide support to help the most vulnerable one, especially who have been facing losses and damage, economic losses, ecosystem losses, and loss of life as well. This is a broader question for all the presenters. And my second question is to UNDRR. We know UNDRR is also helping countries to deal with, let's say, rehabilitation issues and non-economic losses issues in place. And we would like to see whether the current Sani framework is also having, let's say, financial mechanism to address those issues, and whether the current financial mechanism under the TRRO Sani framework is also addressing issue of slow onset. And if this is something that is still taking in place, and then how could we, let's say, address issue of sea level rise in the most vulnerable countries like small island developing states and also LDCs issues in terms of desertification that was also raised by one of the presenters from Africa. Thank you very much.
Sure. I think others may wish to answer the question as well about how the global community can take action. Maybe just a few reflections and let the others kick off. So, I think from my perspective, UNDRR, I think one of the things the global community can do, and it isn't doing yet, is investing in risk reduction. It is probably one of the least resources areas of work. What do I mean by that? We know loss and damages are incurring right now, and they're going to get worse. We've heard about it all morning long, and yet the actions that could be taken at the country level to avoid the consequences and the impact, or at least to minimize them, are often not at all in place. They're not resourced, they're not financed, they're not planned, and they're not programmed by governments. It has never been a priority for governments. So let's talk about the potential impact of floods. We see the same recurrent disasters happening in the same countries year after year after year, even though we know the types of measures that could be put in place to mitigate those impacts from occurring, from avoiding the losses and damages that would occur. So I would, first of all, start to say that we need to do better at understanding what are the risks and putting in place the measures that we know we can do to avert and minimize losses and damages. As you've heard, we have our colleagues from WMO have launched an ambitious program to scale up early warning, right? In 5 years, there should be no citizen who doesn't have access to early warning. We know from the Sendai framework that has a very significant impact in terms of reducing mortality. That is one of the main reasons why mortality has decreased, because of the increase in early warning and preparedness. But the funding isn't there. The financing isn't there. So I think this is a recurrent problem. We know what we need to do, but the funding and the financing isn't available. And often the political will is also not available. These are things that are happening down the line in decades to come. And so therefore, it's not necessarily politically expedient to invest resources today to address what's coming tomorrow. I wish I had an answer for you. I don't. We spend a lot of time advocating with governments, with donors, to invest more in prevention, to demonstrate more that prevention works as part of what we're trying to do. But ultimately, the other piece that we're trying to bring to the table is this comprehensive risk management approach. We don't necessarily deal with sea level rise. Other partners do that, UNEP amongst others, but we can work better together to come up with more holistic and comprehensive approaches for countries, and that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you. We wish to remind our participants that we can still ask questions on the first panel because the speakers are still with us. Maybe we can invite the speakers at the, from the first panel to sit in front so that they, would be seen. Some more questions from the floor?
I'd be happy to also take a go at the question asked by the ambassador from Timor-Leste, if that's okay, Mr. Chair. And thank you for allowing me back on the panel also. The SBI was taking the room where the IPCC was due to present, so that's postponed to 3. So I think they were thinking of us, postponing their start. I think your question is a really important one, and I think, as Loretta indicated, one that the world is struggling with to some extent. And it is a matter of political priorities. It is also a matter of funding. I think we also have to accept that we need to have a different conversation about it. And I think that is starting to happen in our discussions already in Glasgow, but I think also these weeks, including this event right now. The notion that climate change is only this faraway thing that's, well, first of all, primarily framed as ecosystems problems, but then if it was affecting people, sort of these long-term analyses of scenarios, I think that time is past us. And that allows us to see that the urgency of that shift that Loretta is talking about is much higher than before. And that just like we need a transformation in fossil fuel use, we need a transformation in how we manage risk. And if we don't, it's going to be much costlier than doing it fast. And that transformation, if you're talking about comprehensive risk management, is both anticipatory and responsive. Because one of the challenges that we're seeing, and again, our volunteers in these small communities, in these most vulnerable places, are the first witnesses of that. We are seeing shocks increasing vulnerability to the next shock. So one of the things the IPCC Working Group 2 report is also very clear on is there are development pathways where not only we have too much warming to allow a livable societies to be sustained in these places. There are also scenarios where we manage risk so poorly that places will continue to slide. And that means that the way we respond to these risks, the package of comprehensive risk management, is going to be essential for sustainable development, basically. And this is not new. This is in the Sendai framework, for instance, and it was in the Hieber framework before that. So I think we also have many of the building blocks. But I think we need to mobilize the political urgency, which is easier to some extent, sadly, with all the impacts that we're already seeing. And to some extent, maybe also by the extent to which all those climate-related impacts are playing out in a compound way with other shocks that we've been facing, like COVID, like currently the food and energy repercussions of the Ukraine war. So the fact that those things are higher on the political agenda and also the risk management in relation to those things might become a bigger geopolitical issue would allow us to make a more transformational shift in how we address this politically. But I think that is what's asked of us, rather than nitty-gritty marginal improvements in little arrangements under the UNFCCC only. I think this is talking about how we do development.
Absolutely.
Some more insights? Yes, please. We encourage others to, freely exchange views while we still have time, including exchanges amongst speakers. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. And you invited us to also address questions to the first panel, and I would like to do this. My name is Frank Moorhauer. I'm the Director for National Society Development at the IFRC. And I have a question to our first panelist on youth. And it was quite interesting to see how you presented to us how youth is impacted in this area. And I would like to see whether you could expand a little bit about how you engage with youth also to potentially in the programming side, and then how you really ensure that youth is coming up there and is not only the recipient of programs, but also is participating in the programming. So if you could expand a little bit about your experience in this in Niger. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Indeed, what we did with young people, is not just to stay as beneficiaries for some action, but we try to engage them. We develop some program at school area. In some school area, we develop like some green clubs where we try to develop sustainable development and environmental education at school area. So that's allow young people to understand, because the first thing is to understand the challenges that they are facing and how to address them. And we work closely with some research institutions in that can allow young people to better understand the challenges that they are facing on climate change and sustainable development. And as we know, in Niger, for example, we have like 70% of the population that are living in rural area. So it's bad. And our education system is very weak also. So we try to develop the kind of same program, but for young people that are not going to school. So it's the same, we have this kind of program, but we try to work with the traditional leaders, and the traditional leaders have some kind of powerful possibility to discuss and to be heard by young people also. So we let them to address issues with young people at local level. By the way, also we have this program with entrepreneurship one. The Green Entrepreneurship Program is a kind of program because we know that young people the main activities are based on agriculture, and these activities are also affected by climate change, all those things. So we try to develop a kind of incubator or accelerator to help them to gain more knowledge and how they can do it with climate-friendly initiative. So this is the kind of approach that we try to do. And we still have this connection with some universities and also with other international NGOs like IOM also in Niger that work with migrants and internet displacement people. And we have like a recent law in 2018 that was elaborated by the government that tried to develop some protection with people that are facing to some internet displacement. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Some more views from the floor and perhaps from our speakers. I mean, we can have exchange of ideas.
Thank you. I'm Sierra Woodruff from the US, and thank you everyone for this excellent event. The panels have been very enlightening and very good conversation. And it's interesting to hear the emphasis on these integrated approaches. And I'm curious to hear both from the speakers from Fiji and Niger that mentioned how they were using integrated approaches at their national level to describe potentially some of the challenges that you confronted in developing those integrated approaches and how you overcame them. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. In terms of integrated approaches, when we talk about relocation, it's quite a sensitive issue especially in the Pacific, where we move a group of people from their homes to a new area where they have to call home, and we have to come up with integrative approaches to address this in terms of getting their consent. in moving in the first place. Some of the older generations are not so forthcoming with moving, and the younger generations, I think, over their security and their future. So we have to involve CSOs and development partners to assist us in this process. Apart from that, we also, being a small island developing state, we need also the assistance of development partners and multilateral agencies to assist us with this project type work where we're relocating communities. So it's not just a national approach where we're relocating communities, but in that aspect where we use all our other friends, so to speak. Thank you.
Yes, but in Niger, for example, we have like a kind of a national platform with all the stakeholders, like under the three convention post-Rio. So it's like a national platform that we have. The third part is from the government institution, and we have the two third part that are coming from the civil society, the private sector, the member of the parliament. So they have like several meetings, several possibilities to discuss together regarding some issues. And part of this, we develop like a kind of specific platform for youth, for women, and for people with disability also. So it depends on the topic that you are working on. Sometimes they have this possibility to work together. Even actually, we are working to on Nexus humanitarian climate change, environment, and humanitarian development. It's this humanitarian approach on the Nexus that we try to work together, and it works because we have like the national program. So even when we talk with the NDC and the NAP process, it's like a kind of possibility for all the stakeholders to be together and work together. We already present 3 reports on the VNR, on SDGs, so it's a kind of opportunity that allow people to work together closely and to try to deal with the same topics also by the same time. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, just to add on to that, something that just came into my mind. When we're developing policies for relocation, it also involves the broader integrated approach where we take into account the views of all the relevant stakeholders. So I think that is quite an important aspect as well when you look at integrated approaches when it comes to policies of these certain things in terms of loss and damage. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for the wonderful presentations, very informative. I just want to direct our questions to Loretta. I really understand and agree with you in terms of the silos that many countries are working in, especially on climate change and disaster risk. And it's actually very important that they all work together. I don't know if you have some good experiences from your interactions at your level. And I'm really interested to a country that we can learn. I come from Kenya. Maybe introduce myself. I'm Loretta from Kenya. I coordinate climate change adaptation. And I really look forward to learning on how to integrate all these. Is there a country that is doing so well? I have to admit that we have not tightened up that relationship and all working together with all these different institutions. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for the question. Well, for me, the best example is the Pacific, which has an integrated DRR climate change policy. And it has had for several years now. It's not particularly new. It's the idea that you cannot think about disaster risk reduction without thinking about climate change in the Pacific, obviously. So what we're really calling for are integrated approaches, integrated strategies even. Now, especially at the local level, I think it's quite a challenge to ask countries to come up with a loss and damage strategy, a DRR strategy, an adaptation strategy, when essentially what we're really looking at is how do we build resilience against climate-related impacts? Because in most of the countries we're operating, 90% of the disasters are climate-related. So the overlap is enormous. So these integrated strategies, I think, look at the Pacific as a good example. In other countries, what we're really trying to do is to help them have a shared understanding of risk. I've mentioned the RICS as a tool to enable that. And that's really bringing together the climate change actors, who are often the ministries of environment, as well as the disaster risk managers, who tend to sit in other departments. We're starting to help them analyze the policies that they do have in place. So Animesh, who's sitting here, is in charge of that program. And really looking at the overlaps and looking at the points of convergence, and then when possible, perhaps bring them together under a common operationalization plan. So even if you have a strategy that's a bit higher level that's separate, the operationalization and the programming can be joined up in common. So these are some of the pieces of work that we're currently doing. And we're working now in 15 countries, but we hope to expand that to all countries, essentially, because we'd like to see it as the way we work moving forward. Yeah.
If I might...
Yeah,
sorry,
Madam
helpful if
Ambassador.
I... sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. We'll have Madam Ambassador first, then Maarten. Okay, and then there's a colleague who wants to ask at the back of the door. So you're the third, okay? Madam Ambassador,
yes. No, just a small point, maybe on the same line as our colleague from UNDRR, to answer the question of Mr. Director from Kenya. We do as well in IOM, usually say that adaptation is at two levels. And we do develop programs and projects in both, dimensions which are, the technical, if I can say that dimension, and the capacity building. You sometimes still need, if I can say the very traditional, reaction, technical or engineering, reaction like building small walls, trying to canalize, if I can say, a river, protect people on the other side. We do it in Afghanistan, in Southeast Asia, a lot of working on the flows, if I can say, on the water flows, and having still a technical or engineering, reaction and support. But we do feel that these actions are not enough if you do not have a capacity building dimension, which comes to what our colleague from Niger just said. Educating, for instance, people, educating the children to the risks, educating communities, informing them of the risk they are facing, and listening as well to the solutions in terms of, if I'm speaking of communities or different stakeholders, listening to the kind of traditional sometimes solutions, good practices that they know, that they have practiced for centuries, not only decades sometimes, but bringing in a whole of government and a whole of society approach. Policies of capacity building, which are necessary on a wider role or range of activities, whether agricultural, but can be educational, can be health, can be, of course, more on infrastructure. We didn't speak of building properly. And it reminds me of a slogan which was, I think, put and initiated by UK last year, which was "Build Back Better" as well. So the aim at the end is, after the event, if we have to go beyond adaptation, but in reaction, build back better as well, with the good solutions, if I can say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. Maarten?
So thank you for that very good question. I think we're seeing very complementary answers here. So I'll just add a bit to that mix. I think there is a lot to learn from already in the world. We're not looking for one perfect new solution that we're going to sort of create out of. And I think your own country, Kenya, has a lot to offer. I'll just mention social protection, for instance, which is such a crucial strategy. And countries that have better social protection systems have coped better with COVID, but are also coping better with climate shocks. We can tweak those systems to be sharper in light of climate-related shocks as well. I know your country has actually been a leader in that. And it's an example, again, of a sector that has traditionally sort of been operating outside of the climate realm, but connecting the solutions that we create in the UNFCCC context for loss and damage need to find that link. The other one is, I think, between large-scale finance and planning and local governments. And again, I think your examples in Kenya of I think it's called FLOCA, the program where there's payment for results of local level implementation, but primarily coordinated also by county governments, I think is a very interesting one. And I think we need to look at all of these mechanisms that to a large extent already exist and take them to scale. Or maybe one final other element, I fully agree, Loretta, about the Pacific being a leader. I think it's also an interesting example that shows that it takes both time and political leadership. Because I know they had the sort of discussions that are only starting to emerge at the global community level in a way, already in the early 2000s. I was at a meeting in Suva in 2002 of the regional ministers of finance and planning who were discussing climate and disaster risk as a combination, as an economic planning issue. And I think what we're starting to see now is the benefits of two decades of discussion. And I think with the rest of the world, we just have to do it a lot faster. I mean, to some extent, the Pacific is the canary in the coal mine, and I'm happy they're a bit ahead of us as a collective, in the sense that they also face very severe challenges. But I think we're seeing the whole world is facing those challenges now, and we need to speed up learning from their example as well. Thank you.
Yeah, just one more point that occurred to me. I think we really can look to the local level for where we're going to see the types of results that we're looking for in terms of integration. And there is some research that we did in Asia Pacific following COVID, and we found that when local governments had in place already good coordination mechanisms for managing often climate-related disasters, they were in a far better position to manage COVID, for example. And this is what we mean by this comprehensive risk management. And it goes back to what Maarten was saying. We need a transformation in how we manage risk, whether it comes from climate or whether it comes from another source, such as a biological hazard, which was what COVID was. It's changing the mindset that this belongs to one ministry. It's not the National Disaster Management Agency that's going to be able to manage all of the risks that are facing societies. And we see climate change as the greatest driver of risk right now. And so I think really starting locally and looking at how you pull this together at the local level and then build it upwards is a way to address it that perhaps will enable us to have more of a grounding and not meet some of those political challenges you may get from ministries wanting to own their portfolios and potentially compete with each other. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Do we have the last question? But we wish to note that...
Sorry for taking up everyone's time.
That could be brief, yes. Thank you.
I'm Joy Reyes. I work for the Manila Observatory in the Philippines. And this is a question addressed to the speaker from Fiji, although since we're running out of time, maybe we could have this conversation for after. I just wanted to know more about the Displaced Persons Trust Fund and how what mechanisms are in place for accessing the said fund. Because in the Philippines, we have the People's Survival Fund, but that's for long-stream adaptation project financing. And we're also thinking about potential a loss and damage fund, but we weren't sure how to go about with it. Do we have to go through litigation? Is this something that communities and individuals can access by themselves? So that was just something that I wanted to kind of understand from the perspective of Fiji with their trust fund. Thank you.
Thank you. Could Fiji answer that?
Thank you for the question. So the relocation of communities trust fund It was established to just for a fund that where our government had thought to fund relocation projects on ourselves rather than relying on foreign aid and grants through taxing certain luxury items and certain services that are provided by the tourism industry, and a portion of that goes into the relocation trust fund. And there is another trust fund for natural disasters to meet the relief efforts in the short term. So, but that didn't go quite far because it is reliant on the global economy. During the recession, during the Ukraine crisis, during COVID, there was a big recession in our trust fund. And now we're stuck with communities needing relocation, but we just can't find the money. But the good side of it is that we have mechanisms in place where donors can, sorry, how do I say this? Where our development partners have faith in a system that is there, where we have a financing mechanism, how it can be audited. So it kind of gives accountability to some regard as well.
Thank you so much. I think we have realized that I think the conversation should continue, but not now. I mean, I apologize that we have to cut short the side event for now, and we shall be looking forward to much more. We will be producing an outcome report on this and will be posted accordingly. As we thank our panelists, our speakers, on behalf of the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism, we wish to thank our partners here, IOM and the PDD, for the great support in organizing this event. And as I said earlier, a summary report of this event will be made available on the event page. Many thanks to our colleagues in the ExCom, Leanne, Alfonso, Sierra. I saw Kaisa from Sweden, and we shall be here with you to further engage on loss and damage. Many thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very well moderated. Now I do need to rush off again.
Yes, all of us.
But, glad to have you back.
It's lovely to be part of the discussion.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
Thanks. Adelle has
to be continued.
Until then.
Until the next time.
Yes, to be continued.
Because more, it's recurrent and